Welcome to my presentation, Martyring the Madwoman, as an inversion of the Madwoman archetype by Juxtaposition and Synaesthesia and Nadja by André Breton, by me, Caitlin Langdon. So to begin, there was an esteemed novelist, Vladimir Nabokov, who recounted a specific phenomenon in his piece called Speak Memory. He said, "As far back as I can remember, I have been subject to mild hallucinations. Some are oral, others are optical, and by none have I profited much." Known as synesthesia, this condition has long been associated with and explained with diction of mental illness. As a member of the Surrealist movement, André Breton drew upon both mental illness and synesthesia in his novel Nadja, written in 1928, to aid in his exploration of the subconscious self. Upon discussing a psychology and its institution, Breton introduces Nadja as a mentally ill individual with synesthesia. She comes to embody the archetype of the madwoman. But as Breton scorns psychologists and their rational discourse, he ends up subverting readers' expectations of her figure. He mixes two mediums, prose and photography, and these reflect the nuances of her synesthetic psychosis. It effectively encourages her psychologic dialogue and insists upon her freedom. Yet Breton's synesthetic juxtaposition of prose and photography in Nadja harmfully glorifies that subverted depiction of the madwoman. Part 1. As Breton's novel intentionally juxtaposes photos and prose, visual and auditorial elements likewise contrast, representing synesthesia and its part in the madwoman archetypes and the expectation of silence. Breton begins by comparing himself to a ghost, using that definition to describe how he is haunted by who he is, or what that should entail. In a similar manner, the madwoman is often portrayed as haunting and unnerving for her lack of self-control, as she can no longer rationally understand who she is or who she should be as society deems it. Yet thereafter, considering himself, Breton presents Plate 3 and Plate 4, which depict the war veteran and Allard. The ghost of the war veteran proceeds to haunt Breton, and Paul Allard says that Breton looks like his old friend from the war. The inclusion of these pictures after Breton's reflection on his self replace his narrative voice and his identity with a visual and concrete paintings instead. The madwoman is likewise expected to conform in society by remaining silent and allowing her voice to be replaced by psychology's definition and their image of what she should be. We can be assured of Breton seeing psychology as reimagining the madwoman's voice because of a specific juxtaposition of these pictures against the ruminations that precede them on page 24. There, he says, "I am convinced, moreover, that as a discipline, psychoanalysis is not qualified to deal with such phenomena, concerning myself, a virtually continuous subject of meditation and reverie." Breton denies psychology the ability to define the self, and he rejects any rational psychoanalysis as a means for understanding it. Thus, as he chooses this opening before entering Nadja onto the scene as the madwoman, he denies psychology its expectation of silencing and reframes her oncoming voice in its rational discourse. While Breton's use of prose and photography represent synesthetic sound and sight, the combination of these mediums and senses illustrate how the madwoman is expected to remain silent. Combining these mediums, Breton ends up subverting this silence by giving Nadja as a madwoman a voice, only to then objectify her in a new way by demeaning her worth to her dialogue about psychosis. Breton recounts an evening where Nadja, drunk and delirious, says Breton's voice terrifies her all over again, her fear aggravated by her memory of the kiss. And she asks about that hand on the scene. She asks, "Why is that hand flaming over the water? It's true that fire and water are the same thing." Nadja's experience here is subjective and synesthetic in that she associates elements together to form a new emotional meaning, in which, because they are irrational, they embody a psychosis or delirium. To Breton, she initially appears frivolous, but he still gives her the space to express her ideas and stays with her to hear them throughout the night. In that way, the audience realizes the sound of Breton's voice is the physical feeling of a kiss for Nadja, and the red hand is felt as a flaming sensation. Once Breton realizes Nadja's subconscious mind is a juxtaposition of the senses, he informs his own novel with the motif of a hand and other elements in multiple forms to replicate her perspective and show, through his own work, her subconscious. The hand is shown as a lover's hand next to the mention of a maison rouge or hotel. It is also on a poster at the Dortmund bookstore, and it is yet also Georgi de Cerco's painting, The Enigma of Fatality, from plate 38. All of these show that Breton represents Nadja's experience and voice through images. However, Breton simultaneously has an aesthetic motive behind allowing space for Nadja's voice and objectifies it for its visual use of the subconscious. He highlights the irrational associations that lead to the emotional meaning for Nadja, to show how those associations are below the threshold of her conscious thoughts. Before noting the flaming hand, Breton juxtaposes a photo of the fountain and notes that Nadja is gazing out over the river as lights reflect off the water. The implication is that while she may not even realize it, her thoughts of fire and water may have arisen from the connection between light and fire and their hands in the fountain that they witnessed just before this. The perpetuating placement of the hand, then, throughout the novel is also significant, as on a first reading, its repetition in significance is not noticed by the reader. It is only that the hand becomes a physical subliminal association for the reader once they read it again or research it later. The intricacy of this flaming hand shows Breton was concerned with the effect it was producing as an example of the irrational subconscious as Nadja spoke of it, and not the expression of her experience itself. So he only further entrenches her in her madness. The deliberate representation then in the novel serves as evidence that ultimately Breton doesn't care about Nadja as a person, but only for her psychotic dialogue. So while Breton fights for the voices of those labeled as mad, he does so only for the aesthetic purpose they may produce, effectively dehumanizing them. At the end of the novel, there's a discussion about psychological institutions, and we see that Nadja has ended up in an asylum. On page 138, Breton chooses to post plate 43, which depicts a suited man with glasses with the title, Like Professor Claude at St. Anne, which we can see on the screen. This figure is a psychiatrist who perpetuates the trope of the madwoman by conceding with the psychologists of the time that it should be as difficult to leave asylums today as it once was to leave a coven. In other words, the madwoman is expected to be hidden from society, and she is supposed to be treated unequally by being locked up, often in that repeated form of the attic or the basement. However, Breton engages and acknowledges the conventions of this trope by juxtaposing the voice of this restrained professor, Professor Claude, against his own uncontrolled and long-winded rumination of how asylums have become like prisons. To contrast the silencing effect evoked by Paul Elard's photo, the photo of Professor Claude represents the voice of the asylum institution, which, Breton argues, can only be understood through sight. For unless you've been inside a sanitarium, he says, you do not know that madmen are made there. So while he is arguing, this visual voice of St. Anne, embodied by Professor Claude, becomes the secondary voice that Breton is in dialogue with. And to it, Breton says, as I see it, all confinements are arbitrary. I still cannot see why a human being should be deprived of freedom. His refusals to agree with the practice of locking up the mad begins to allow a subversion of the madwoman archetype by instead insisting on a necessary freedom in society. Breton allows Nadja a sense of freedom by engaging with her experiences not as society would expect it, but by her psychotic moments represented through synaesthetic drawings and writings. Breton juxtaposes her voice against visual artwork by listing her strange phrases directly before the inclusion of her drawings. Some phrases he uses are, pink is better than black, but the two harmonize, and I want to touch serenity with a finger wet with tears. These are positioned on the page against plate 29, which is a drawing of eye-like petals supported by a snake that we can see on the left, and plate 30, a bird encompassing a man with a siren beside him, which we can see on the middle there. The experience is once again synesthetic for two reasons here. First, Nadja's words mix color and sounds, as pink and black harmonize, as if they are a sound. Then they mix emotions with physical touch, as serenity is touched with wet fingers. Then the drawings mix sight with scent and physical sensations. The petals have eyes, and the bird-captured man eyes are glowing for sight. The flower is a representation of scent, and the snake implies its bite, just as well as the bird's feather can imply the feeling of wind in flight. This combination of multiple senses captures the exact way that Nadja feels in this moment. It works as a blueprint of her mind and her emotions, and it is not rational, and it is not a norm that society would accept. In this way, it is free from society rules of expression. Additionally, Nadja admits that she writes and draws these as a representation of her relationships with Breton. It is an emotional representation of how she feels about him and her together. It is a free of expression of her love, and it mirrors a stream of consciousness writing or abstract art for emotional effect, rather than intellectual morals or themes. Now, while these drawings are freeing by allowing Nadja an expression of love and by being outside of society's norm, Breton does not treat her as an equal, but he abuses these tokens of affection as the very psychologist would that he so hates, because he wants to represent her subconscious mind. He psychoanalyzes the photos to understand that everything was arranged to permit the descent of what she called the human reflector, kept up by four scepters, of which she said was the best of all. He reads into the juxtaposition of her senses and projects the meanings of her words onto her visual artwork so that the drawings speak for her. As such, he steals the freedom he so argues for because he ends up fettering her to the very work of what she produces rather than to see her as a viable lover. In contrast to the psychiatrist who would use these drawings to understand Nadja and her inner turmoil, he uses them to argue that the subconscious mind can be accessed once and that we need to lean into these subliminal associations. He uses her as the standard, the example, something that we should follow, and thus he confines her to an experience. Breton may appear as an advocate who is set on destigmatizing madness as he subverts the typical madwoman archetype. He refuses to silence those with mental illness, and he does not stand for their imprisonment. However, in this very process, Breton develops his very own typification and objectification of Nadja in her madness for his aesthetic theory. The juxtaposition of his prose and photography represent a synesthesia and psychosis that is not designed to hear the voice of Nadja or to make her equal to him as her lover. Rather, he does all of this to reveal the fundamental irrationality that is facilitated by her synesthetic subliminal associations to represent the subconscious mind. Thus, when the audience reads Breton's description of her complaints, where she says, quote, "Now she tells me of my power over her, of my faculty for making her think and do whatever I desire, perhaps more than I think I desire," the issue should be immediately clear. Nadja certainly has moments of lucidity, and they scream of Breton's very manipulation of her as a madwoman. Thank you for listening and for your time.